He always looked composed, the kind of man whose voice never wavered, whose smile seemed practiced but warm enough to pass for genuine. To the world, he was steady, successful, kind. But she saw something beneath it, something that flickered whenever the world wasn't watching, a tremor of fear, a quiet loneliness that clung to the edges of his confidence. They met in a moment that didn't feel accidental. It was late autumn, the kind of day when the air carried both chill and clarity. She wasn't looking for anything new, not love, not attention, not the ache that came from caring too deeply. But when their eyes met, something familiar stirred, like recognizing a melody she'd heard before but couldn't name. From the beginning, he kept his distance behind warmth. He said the right things, asked the right questions, but never lingered long enough to be truly known. She didn't mind at first. She understood guarded people, she was one once. But as weeks passed, she began to notice the pattern, how he would open up just enough to make her believe, then retreat into silence like a tide pulling away before it could touch the shore. He carried light in one hand and shadow in the other. His laughter came easily, but his eyes, they carried storms. When she tried to look deeper, he'd change the subject or joke it away. There were moments she thought she imagined it all, the sadness behind his words, the guilt that clung to his pauses. But late one night, she saw it clearly. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. It was in the sigh he tried to disguise as a breath. The truth was simple, he was hiding. Not from her, but from himself. And still, she cared. Against her better judgment, against the warnings in her spirit, she cared. Because something about him felt sacred, unfinished, like a soul God wasn't done shaping. She didn't want to save him, she just wanted to understand what made him build those walls so high. One evening, as they sat on the steps of an old chapel, he spoke about faith. "I used to believe God saw me," he said quietly. "Then life happened, and I started wearing a mask so he wouldn't." She turned to him, her heart tightening. "Do you really think you can hide from God?" He smiled faintly, eyes distant. "Not from him. Just from the people he sends." It was then she realized his armor wasn't pride, it was pain. The mask wasn't deception, it was protection. Somewhere in his past, trust had broken, and he hadn't known how to rebuild it. So he played roles instead, the strong man, the funny friend, the reliable one, never the real one. But God sees through masks. And in ways only heaven could orchestrate, the time had come for truth to rise. That night, when she prayed, she didn't ask for him to open up. She asked God to help her see him the way heaven did, without the layers, without the fear, without the facade. And something began to shift. Dreams started visiting her, glimpses of him standing in a storm, his mask breaking, light pouring from his eyes as if something divine was finally being revealed. Each time she woke, she felt God whisper, "He's being undone so he can be rebuilt." Meanwhile, his life began to unravel in small, holy ways. People who once praised him started asking hard questions. Plans fell apart. Hidden things began surfacing, old wounds, old regrets, moments he had buried under success. At first, he panicked, believing it was punishment. But deep down, a new awareness stirred. Maybe this was mercy disguised as chaos. He started feeling drawn to silence, long drives without music, walks without his phone. In those quiet moments, memories surfaced. A younger version of himself, standing in church, eyes closed, whispering prayers he no longer remembered. The memory hit him hard. That boy had believed. That boy had loved God freely before shame built walls around his heart. And now, God was calling that boy back. It scared him. Vulnerability always had. But there was something about her, her patience, her peace, that made him believe God wasn't angry, just waiting. She didn't demand his truth, she created space for it. And slowly, the mask began to crack. He confessed small things first, the loneliness behind his laughter, the doubt beneath his confidence. Then came deeper truths, the relationship that broke him, the mistakes he carried like invisible chains, the fear that if anyone saw the real him, they'd walk away. But she didn't. Instead, she said softly, "Maybe you've spent so long pretending to be unbreakable that you forgot God meets people in their breaking." Her words stayed with him. That night, he wept for the first time in years. Not the quiet, controlled kind of crying he allowed himself when no one could see, but the soul-deep kind that felt like surrender. And in that surrender, something holy happened. The mask didn't fall off in one piece, it shattered slowly, truth by truth, until he could breathe again. What he didn't know was that while he was being undone, God was working in her too, teaching her that love isn't about rescuing someone, it's about witnessing their redemption without taking credit for it. In the days that followed, his world began to quiet in ways that felt unfamiliar. The noise he used to cling to, the endless busyness, the distraction, the laughter that filled silence, no longer worked. He'd sit in his car after work and just stare at the steering wheel, thinking about the life he had built around pretending. For the first time, pretending felt heavy. He started writing again. Not the kind of writing that people would ever read, but the kind that leaked truth. At first it was messy, full of anger and half-sentences, but as the days passed, the words softened into something closer to prayer. He wrote about the guilt he still carried, about the moments he wished he could erase, about the way he'd spent years trying to deserve love instead of receiving it. One night he wrote, "I am so tired of hiding. If you can still see me, show me who I am without the mask." And somehow, even before the ink dried, he felt the answer. Not in words, but in peace. Around that same time, she started sensing him in her prayers again. It wasn't obsession, it was awareness. Every time she whispered his name, she felt a pulse of compassion, not longing. God was teaching her to intercede without attachment, to love without losing herself. She understood now that love wasn't about being chosen, it was about being faithful to the light you carried. When they met again, weeks later, he looked different. There was still weariness in his eyes, but something else too, honesty. He told her quietly, "I don't know who I am without the walls." She smiled. "Maybe that's the best place to start." He nodded, and for once didn't try to fill the silence. They walked together through the city streets as evening settled, talking about faith, about forgiveness, about how sometimes God dismantles everything that isn't true just to reveal what is. He didn't realize it then, but this was what grace looked like, not a sudden miracle, but a slow unveiling. Meanwhile, life kept testing him. Old temptations returned, people misunderstood his change, some drifted away. Yet through every challenge, he felt the quiet pull of something higher guiding him forward. The more truth he allowed, the lighter he became. He stopped over-explaining himself. He stopped needing everyone to see him as good. Instead, he wanted to be real. And in that realness, he found God again, not in grand gestures, but in ordinary moments, a sunrise, a conversation, a verse that landed exactly where his heart was aching. She saw the change too. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. When he spoke now, his words carried weight. When he prayed, it wasn't for show. She realized that God wasn't just unveiling him, he was unveiling the purpose of their connection. It had never been about romance or rescue. It was about awakening. He told her one evening, "For years I asked God to bless what I built. I never thought maybe He wanted to rebuild it entirely." She laughed softly. That's how He works. He doesn't polish masks. He removes them. He smiled at that, but his eyes glistened. Then maybe losing everything was the best thing that happened to me. She reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of quiet support. Sometimes you have to lose who you were pretending to be before you can remember who you are. In that moment, he felt something lift. It wasn't just about her. It was about God showing him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was worship. Later, alone under a sky streaked with stars, he whispered, "Thank you for showing me what I was afraid to see." The wind moved through the trees, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Days turned into weeks, and though they didn't speak every day, their connection deepened in understanding rather than dependency. She was learning patience, he was learning presence. And both were learning trust. There came a night when he stood before the mirror, looking at his reflection. The man staring back at him looked tired but real. No more polished facade, no more forced smiles. He breathed deeply and said aloud, "I forgive you." It was strange speaking those words to himself, but as he did, tears came. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about releasing it. Because the mask had never been about hiding sin, it had been about hiding shame. And now, as grace filled the room, shame had no place left to live. At the same time, she was on her own quiet journey. She had begun journaling every time she sensed a shift in her spirit. The entries were less about him and more about the lessons God was teaching her, how to love without rescuing, how to listen instead of fixing, how to trust that divine revelation always comes in perfect timing. She wrote, "I used to pray for his heart to be revealed. Now I pray for both of us to see truth clearly, even if it changes everything." That night, she dreamed of him again, standing in a vast field under light that didn't come from the sun. He wasn't wearing a mask anymore. His face was calm, open, radiant. When he turned toward her, she heard a voice, not his, but God's, say, "See, I am making all things new." She woke up crying, not from sadness, but from awe. Because she knew the dream wasn't just about him. It was about both of them, about every heart that hides behind fear and every soul God intends to set free. Weeks became months. The seasons turned quietly, and with them came a gentler rhythm. The chaos that had once filled his days eased into stillness. He had stopped running, from himself, from truth, from the weight of grace that had always been reaching for him. He met her again on an afternoon when the wind smelled of rain. They hadn't seen each other for a while, life had drawn them into different spaces. But when they met, there was no tension, only calm recognition. He told her what had changed. "It's strange," he said, "I used to think God was waiting for me to be perfect. Now I know He was just waiting for me to be honest." She smiled, quiet and knowing. That's when love can finally breathe, when you stop hiding from the one who already knows everything. They walked by the riverside. The water was low, slow-moving, catching bits of sunlight between ripples. He spoke about the new work he'd begun, mentoring young people who felt invisible, helping them tell their stories without shame. He said it made him feel alive, useful. She listened, grateful. "You always had a voice meant to heal," she said. "Maybe all this time, God was teaching you how to use it." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that doesn't need words. "And you," he said softly, "were the reminder that not everyone comes to expose you. Some come to help you see." The breeze moved through the trees like a quiet hymn. They both knew something sacred had completed. The story wasn't about winning each other, it was about finding freedom. The connection between them no longer pulled with need, it flowed with peace. After they parted, he went home and opened his journal. On a clean page he wrote, "The mask is gone. The face beneath it isn't perfect, but it's real. And that's where God lives, in what's real." That night he slept deeply, dreaming of light spilling through every corner of a once dark house. He moved through each room, opening windows, letting the air in. When he woke, he realized the house was his heart, and every window opened was another truth revealed. She, meanwhile, found herself drawn to new beginnings. She started teaching others about spiritual resilience, about how waiting and faith can transform pain into purpose. Whenever someone asked where her strength came from, she would smile and say, "From learning that God's light exposes only to heal." One evening, she found one of her old unsent letters, the ones she had written in the waiting years. The ink had faded, but the feeling remained. She read it and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for what she gained, but for what she learned. That love born of God always leads to truth, and truth always leads to freedom. Time continued, as it always does. They would cross paths occasionally, at gatherings, in the quiet hum of community life, and every time, there was mutual respect, deep peace. No unfinished business, no longing left unspoken. Just gratitude. He still wore a smile, but it was different now, unforced, clear, light. People around him noticed. "You seem different," they'd say. And he would reply, "I just stopped pretending." In quiet moments, he still prayed for her, not out of longing, but thanksgiving. Because some people are sent not to stay forever, but to help you meet the truth that does. And she prayed too. For him. For herself. For every hidden heart still wearing a mask, afraid that truth will destroy them. She prayed they would see what she now knew, that when God unveils, He doesn't shame, He restores. Months later, she stood in that same chapel where they once sat talking about faith. The candles flickered gently. She bowed her head and whispered, "Thank you for showing us what was hidden." A sense of warmth flooded her chest, a quiet assurance that everything had unfolded exactly as heaven intended. Outside, the wind lifted the leaves, carrying them down the old stone steps like blessings in motion. Somewhere far off, church bells began to ring. He walked through the same streets that night, the sound reaching him through the air. He paused, smiling to himself. The bells felt like closure, or maybe beginning, he couldn't tell which. But he didn't need to. Truth had already done its work. In the stillness of that moment, both of them, miles apart yet held by the same grace, whispered the same prayer, "Thank you for unveiling what was hidden. Thank you for setting us free, And in heaven's quiet echo, the answer was already written. Because when God lifts the mask, He doesn't expose to wound, He reveals to redeem. And every truth revealed in love becomes the light that leads us home.